The city rose each morning like a restless spirit. Tall glass buildings caught the sun and threw it back into the sky, while below them, old markets breathed dust, spice, and memory. Cars rushed past shrines that had stood longer than the roads themselves. Traders shouted prices learned from their fathers, even as billboards promised faster lives and bigger dreams. In this city, ambition walked quickly and rarely looked back. People chased tomorrow so hard that yesterday was often left behind, buried under concrete and noise. Yet in the middle of this speed stood a family home that refused to hurry. Its walls were old, its gate heavy, its courtyard shaped by many seasons. Inside, footsteps were soft. Words were chosen carefully. Morning prayers were whispered, not announced. The home held silence the way a calabash holds water, not empty, but full and precious. Silence here meant respect. It meant listening. It meant knowing that not every truth needs a loud voice to survive. The world outside did not understand this quiet. In the city, strength was measured by how hard a man could speak and how firmly he could command. Men were praised for control, for bending others to their will. Women were praised for endurance, for carrying pain without complaint. Slowly, wisdom lost its seat, pushed aside by loud authority. Old sayings were laughed at, and patience was called weakness. Power no longer asked for balance, it demanded obedience. In this home lived a pregnant woman who watched more than she spoke. Her eyes missed nothing, even when her face showed little. She moved with care, one hand often resting on her belly, where new life waited. To some, her pregnancy made her fragile. To others, it made her slow. But inside her was a calm that came from deep places. She understood weight and balance, waiting and timing. When she entered a room, the air seemed to settle, as if it knew something important had arrived. "Why are you always quiet?" a relative once asked her, half mocking, half curious. She only smiled gently. "A river that makes the most noise," she replied softly, "is often the shallow one." Neighbors whispered about her. They called her too soft, too obedient. They said she would break easily under pressure, like clay before fire. Some pitied her. Others dismissed her. They looked at her lowered eyes and slow steps and thought they had already measured her worth. They did not know that clay, when shaped well and fired at the right time, becomes stronger than stone. From a young age, the woman had learned that strength did not live in the arms alone. It lived in the breath, in the pause before action, in the respect shown to unseen forces. At dawn, when the city was still quiet, she would sit on a woven mat, eyes closed, hands resting lightly on her knees. She greeted the day the way her ancestors had taught, without hurry, without noise. Her late grandmother's words often returned to her like a soft drumbeat. "If you cannot rule your spirit, you will never rule your path." Those words shaped her steps. She listened more than she spoke. She waited more than she demanded. To her, patience was not weakness, it was a shield. Restraint was not fear, it was wisdom. When others lost their temper, she found her center. When insults came, she swallowed them like bitter herbs, trusting time to sweeten the lesson. Her strength was quiet, but it was complete. Few people knew the path that had taught her to stand unbroken. Long before the city claimed her days, before marriage and expectation wrapped around her life, she had crossed paths with a man who walked like the wind. Some said he was a wandering master. Others believed hardship itself had trained her. No one knew the full truth, and she never corrected them. Sometimes, at night, when the house slept, she moved alone in the courtyard. Her feet touched the ground with care. Her body flowed through shapes learned in silence. Every movement carried respect. Every strike ended before harm could grow. To her, this discipline was sacred. It was not learned to dominate, but to protect, to guard life, dignity, and balance. "The hand must obey the heart," the old master had once told her. "And the heart must answer to justice." So she trained her breath before her body, her mind before her fists. Violence was never her desire. It was a last door, opened only when all others failed. Her husband lived a different truth. The city praised him, and he believed every word. His clothes were sharp, his voice sharper. Success followed him like a shadow, and pride walked beside it. People greeted him with smiles that bent too quickly. At home, he often frowned at his wife's calm ways. "Why do you always look so small?" he once said. People must see power to respect it. She lowered her eyes, not in shame, but in choice. He mistook her silence for emptiness. He believed authority had to be loud, feared, and displayed. In his eyes, humility was a flaw, not a virtue. Slowly, without noticing, he stepped farther from the wisdom that had once guided his family. And while he stood tall in the city's noise, he failed to see the quiet strength growing beside him, steady, patient, and waiting for its moment. The husband's footsteps no longer followed the rhythm of the home. They moved to the beat of the city, fast, proud, hungry for praise. In places where music was loud and lights hid the truth, he met a woman who shone like polished glass. She laughed boldly, dressed richly, and spoke as if the world owed her attention. Beside her, he felt important. "She makes me look powerful," he told himself. "People notice me when I stand with her." Slowly, desire turned into betrayal. Women became mirrors for his ego, not partners of the soul. At home, his wife's pregnancy began to irritate him. Her careful steps, her quiet needs, her growing belly, he saw them as delays. "You're always tired," he said one evening, clicking his tongue. "Everything has become slow since this pregnancy." She looked at him gently. "Life grows at its own pace," she replied. He did not listen. To him, the unborn child was no longer a blessing, but an inconvenience. The wound deepened on the day he crossed a line no man should cross. Without warning, he brought the other woman through the gate of his ancestral home. Neighbors paused in their steps. Children stopped playing. The courtyard, once a place of peace, stiffened like offended earth. "This is my house," he announced loudly. "She will stay." The mistress smiled, her eyes scanning the walls as if measuring territory. Customs shattered in that moment. Elders who heard the news shook their heads. Whispers spread like dry grass fire. A sacred space had been polluted by pride. An old uncle stepped forward. "My son," he warned softly, "a home is not a marketplace." The husband waved him off. "Old words," he said. "This is a modern time." Tradition bowed its head, wounded but not dead. Through it all, the wife said nothing. She stood still, one hand resting on her belly, her face calm. Some mistook her silence for defeat. Others felt uneasy, as if a drumbeat had stopped too suddenly. The mistress laughed lightly. "She doesn't even fight for her place," she mocked. "I thought wives cried." But silence was the wife's shield. Inside her, breath was steady. Control was complete. The storm did not roar, it gathered. Soon, signs appeared. A clay pot cracked without being touched. The wind moved strangely through closed doors. The house felt different, as if it remembered what had been done to it. Then the outsider began to claim what was not hers. She gave orders to servants, changed routines, spoke from the wife's seat. Respect fell apart piece by piece. The home, once balanced, tilted. Still, the wife watched. Still, she waited. For in African wisdom, the deepest river makes no sound. And when it finally moves, it does not ask permission. The mistress's voice soon became the loudest sound in the house. She laughed often, and her laughter cut like a blade wrapped in silk. Each time the wife passed quietly through the room, the woman from the city would tilt her head and smile with mock surprise. "Does she ever speak?" she asked one afternoon, her eyes roaming over the wife's calm face and rounded belly. "Or has pregnancy taken even her words?" A few servants laughed nervously. The mistress touched her own flat stomach and scoffed. In the city, women work until the very day strength leaves them. Here, she walks as if carrying gold. Her laughter rang again, sharp, careless. Pregnancy, once honored as sacred duty, was turned into a joke. Compassion slipped out of the room, chased away by cruelty dressed as confidence. The husband did not stop her. Instead, he smiled. "You see," he said loudly, glancing at his wife. "Boldness is strength. Silence makes people forget you exist." The mistress leaned closer to him, pleased. "A woman who cannot fight for her place," she said, "does not deserve it." He nodded, his pride swelling. With every insult, his approval grew. Authority that once should have protected now pointed its finger to shame. When his wife lowered her eyes, He mistook dignity for defeat. "Speak," he demanded once. "Defend yourself." But she did not. And he shook his head in disgust, as if her calm exposed a failure in her soul. Slowly, the house began to divide. Servants whispered in corners. Some bowed deeper to the mistress, hoping favor would keep their positions safe. Others avoided the wife's gaze, ashamed of their silence. Neighbors leaned over fences, trading rumors like goods in the market. "They say she is weak," one woman murmured. "They say the husband has every right," another replied. Fear of wealth sealed many mouths. Truth became dangerous. Gossip ran faster than justice ever could. Even among relatives, loyalty bent. Those who once greeted the wife warmly now measured their words. Comfort became more important than conscience. A cousin who knew better whispered, "This is not our fight." An aunt said softly, "Times have changed." Elders noticed, but their voices were no longer strong enough to shake the walls of pride. One old man sighed, tapping his staff against the ground. "When gold speaks," he said, "wisdom must wait." Inside all this noise, the wife found a deeper quiet. At night, when the house slept, she sat alone and rested her hands on her belly. She listened, not to insults, not to laughter, but to the slow rhythm of life growing inside her. "My child," she whispered, her voice barely moving the air, "you will not be born into anger." She felt strength rise, not from rage, but from purpose. This pregnancy was not a burden. It was her anchor. Each breath she took was for protection, not revenge. Each calm step was a promise. Outside her door, the house continued to crack and divide. Inside her heart, resolve settled like stone at the bottom of a river, silent, steady, and waiting. For in the old stories, mothers do not roar like lions. They endure like the earth. And when the time comes, the earth does not argue. It simply moves. The quiet of the night wrapped around her like a familiar cloak, and memories rose without sound. She saw herself as a child, feet planted on dusty ground, hands lifted in careful forms, moving through shapes taught by a master whose voice was as soft as wind over the savannah. Every movement had a reason, every pause, a lesson. Patience was learned before speed, balance before strength, restraint before action. The motions she had practiced for years were not just steps, they were etched into her bones, remembered by the marrow and the muscle. Each recollection reminded her that true power waited, unshaken, within control. Her ancestors spoke to her through these memories. She heard their lessons in the rhythm of her breath, in the calm of her heartbeat. "A hand that strikes too soon serves no one," her grandmother had said. "A tongue that shouts without knowing invites ruin." Strength, her elders had taught, was not in showing force, but in guiding it with wisdom. In every careful step, she carried the patience of generations, a river flowing silently but with immense depth. Her calm was not absence, it was presence, vast and deliberate. She had learned the sacred law of waiting for the right moment. A tree does not force its fruit, a river does not rush its course. So too must strength reveal itself only when justice calls. The world outside demanded noise, clamor, and show, yet she knew that loudness often betrays the unready. Stillness sharpened her senses, restraint honed her spirit. The tension within her body was a spring coiled, not idle, but prepared. The elders tried to speak to her husband, but wisdom moves softly. They approached him like rivers approaching the ocean, through proverbs, through stories of kings who fell for pride, through subtle warnings that required thought to decode. "A hunter who counts only his prey may forget the forest," one said. "The house that forgets the river will thirst forever." They did not raise voices, did not force him to see, but their words echoed like drums in the distance. He laughed at them. "These are the ways of old men," he said. "I do not need chains of the past to walk into the future." Tradition was a weight he refused to carry, and with each dismissal, his ego grew heavier, his humility thinner. Success in the city fed this arrogance. He measured power in gestures and gold, in command and display. The bustling streets, the high towers, the applause of peers, it all confirmed his belief that dominance was strength. Yet, each lesson the elders whispered, each memory she carried, each breath counted in silence, was preparing her for the day when the unseen would rise. While the city praised his loud victories, she tended the quiet victories of patience, discipline, and ancestral wisdom. In her calm, the roots of generations deepened, and power waited, patient as the earth itself. The mistress moved through the house like a storm of polished glass and sharp perfume, her every step claiming the space as if the walls belonged to her. She laughed at the servants, flaunted her wealth, and spoke in tones that demanded obedience. "This house is mine as much as his," she said one morning, brushing past the wife with a careless smile. "Do you understand that?" She saw the family home not as sanctuary, but as territory. Windows, floors, and doorways became stages for her display. Mirrors reflected her vanity. The household itself was reduced to props in her performance of dominance. No warning of the consequences crossed her mind. Greed and entitlement blinded her, and ambition sharpened without thought. The wife, calm and watchful, moved silently among the shifting currents. The mistress dismissed her at every turn. "She is too quiet to matter," she whispered to the husband, laughing. "I do not need to fear her." Yet, in her underestimation, she could not see the strength that gathered like a river beneath the surface. Small acts of cruelty were assigned to the wife daily. She polished floors until her knees ached, carried water from distant wells, and straightened rooms in silence while the mistress lounged. Every task was public, performed under the gaze of servants and relatives who feared to speak. Each humiliation left marks not on her body, but on her dignity, testing patience beyond what seemed bearable. Her pregnancy, once honored, was now mocked. She felt eyes trace her belly with judgment rather than reverence. "So slow, so careful," the mistress said, leaning over with a cruel smile. "Does she even know she carries life, or is it just an excuse for laziness?" Cultural taboos were broken openly. Sacred spaces and rituals were ignored. Compassion had fled the walls, leaving only the mistress's laughter echoing through them. Yet the wife remained unbroken. She stood cornered, pressed by insult and ridicule, but her mind remained sharp. Each slight, each whisper, each public order to submit was met with stillness. Restraint itself became her resistance. She did not strike, did not cry, did not fight. She waited. Every insult, every task designed to humiliate, sharpened her resolve. Silence grew heavy, deliberate, and controlled. With each passing day, she transformed the weight of humiliation into quiet power, storing patience like a blade hidden in her heart. The household did not see it yet, but the calm waters beneath the surface were deepening, ready to rise when the moment demanded justice. The house had begun to breathe uneasily. Objects once in place now fell without reason, a cracked bowl here, a chair tipped over there, small signs that whispered of eyes unseen. Harmony had left the walls. The air carried tension like the low hum of distant drums. Even the wind seemed unsettled, rustling through the courtyard with a voice the family could not understand. Windows rattled without storm, shadows lingered longer than they should, and the sun fell differently across the rooms. Nature itself seemed to watch, holding its breath, while the household descended into a quiet chaos that no human hand could restore. At night, the wife's sleep became a doorway to messages only she could read. Dreams arrived like messengers from the past, rivers swollen with unknown weight, broken trees that bled light, and scales tipping in ways that demanded attention. Faces of ancestors appeared in the clouds of her vision, their eyes steady and knowing, speaking of justice, balance, and reckoning. She awoke each morning with the weight of the future pressing against the present, feeling the pulse of events yet to come, yet unable to tell another soul. And then, silence. Not the peace of night, but a spiritual absence that unsettled the home. The ancestors' usual guidance, signs, whispers, gentle warnings, stopped. Their quiet was louder than any voice, signaling that judgment had drawn near. The household, still unaware of the storm gathering, moved through the day as though on fragile ice, every action shadowed by consequences yet unseen. She prepared quietly, with the care of one tending a sacred fire. Each breath measured, each step deliberate, every movement purposeful. Her body, swollen with life, moved with ease, strength coiled beneath her calm exterior. She did not speak of power. She did not flex or announce her readiness. Yet every fiber of her being was sharpened, her mind alert, her reflexes honed. Preparation was complete, but invisible to all around her. Outside, the world remained unaware of the brewing tempest. The husband flaunted his dominance, the mistress laughed with careless greed, and the servants whispered without daring to act. Pride blinded them all. Yet tension thickened like storm clouds across the home and the community. Justice moved closer, steady and inevitable, unseen but certain, threading through the spaces where arrogance had claimed safety. The air grew heavy. Even silence pressed against the ears, the walls, and the heart. Each character, absorbed in their own world of denial and ambition, stood unknowingly on the precipice. Nothing stirred, and yet everything trembled. The calm was unbearable, the pause so deep that the ground itself seemed to wait for the breaking point. The hour of reckoning hovered just beyond sight, and the world held its breath in anticipation. The courtyard was alive with the hum of voices, yet beneath it lingered a tension that weighed heavier than the mid-morning sun. Family members gathered, elders perched with quiet authority, neighbors whispered among themselves, and strangers' eyes darted, curious and judgmental. Every gaze seemed to measure, weigh, and record, turning the space into a court where silence held as much power as speech. Children paused mid-laugh, sensing the currents of unspoken conflict, while the wind carried murmurs across the assembled crowd like a warning drumbeat. The wife moved among them, her steps measured, her posture calm, as if she alone understood the gravity of the day. The celebration should have been joyous, a naming ceremony, a festival of harvest, a wedding blessing, but the air carried an edge sharper than any blade. Laughter rang, yet it was hollow, heavy with malice. Behind every polite smile, eyes watched for weakness. "She thinks herself strong," someone muttered, voice almost lost in the crowd. The mistress flitted through the gathering like a sunbeam turning sharp, her every word carefully aimed to wound without appearing cruel. Music played, drums beat, yet the rhythm felt disjointed, carrying tension rather than joy. The sacred space, once meant to honor ancestors and life's milestones, had been transformed into a stage for pride. Ceremonial cloths hung with ostentation, the elders' usual authority bypassed, and rituals performed not in respect but to amplify one man's arrogance. "Watch how easily she bends," the husband whispered to the mistress, his voice dripping with triumph. Tradition, once a vessel of wisdom, had been twisted to elevate dominance and humiliate humility. The scent of incense, once meant to cleanse and bless, seemed to mingle with the bitterness of envy. Then the provocation began, deliberate and precise. The wife was pushed forward, tested before the crowd, and embarrassed subtly but sharply. A misplaced comment, a staged misstep, a servant's whispered instruction to perform a menial task in plain view, all orchestrated. The wife's eyes, calm yet alert, surveyed the reactions around her. Many felt discomfort, some recognized the cruelty, yet no one intervened. Her silence was a shield, her restraint a quiet declaration that the moment had not yet come. Faces surrounded her, many watching intently, few daring to act. Elders' eyes met hers, sorrow and understanding flickering briefly before they turned away. Neighbors whispered, but fear silenced boldness. Curiosity was stronger than courage. Observation replaced action. Every glance, every gasp, every murmur became part of the spectacle, feeding the husband's sense of power. Yet beneath the surface, the unseen currents of patience and ancestral guidance coiled like a storm waiting to break. The air trembled with anticipation, and those who looked too closely could feel it, the calm before justice. The courtyard fell silent the moment he spoke, though many had tried to laugh off the tension before. "You are useless," the husband declared, his voice sharp and cutting, slicing through the chatter and music of the gathering. "Weak. You cannot even defend yourself or the child you carry." The words struck like stones, echoing against the walls, reverberating through the crowd, leaving a trail of shock and discomfort. Neighbors whispered nervously, elders frowned but said nothing, and the mistress smiled, her triumph sharp and cruel. The wife's face remained calm, but inside, a storm of betrayal and indignity raged. Every ounce of her dignity seemed stripped away before the very community that had gathered to honor life and family. He stepped closer, gesturing toward her swollen belly. "Look at her," he said, voice rising. "This child will grow in weakness. She cannot protect herself, let alone this unborn life." Around him, laughter bubbled, though nervous, and the elders shifted uneasily. The sacredness of pregnancy, once revered as power and continuity, had been reduced to helplessness, a tool for humiliation. A hush fell across the courtyard, heavier than the insult itself. It was as if the words had awakened something ancient, a moral boundary that no man dared cross lightly. The air vibrated with the weight of injustice. Eyes that had avoided judgment now turned, watching for the unseen response. It was not anger, yet it carried the authority of generations, the moment when wrongdoing demanded correction. Suddenly, a shadow of danger emerged. A man, emboldened by the husband's mockery, advanced toward her. Perhaps he intended to push, to provoke, or worse. Her hand instinctively moved toward her belly, shielding life that had done no wrong. The crowd held its breath. The unborn child's presence seemed to magnify the risk, and for a heartbeat, the world felt fragile, as though the earth itself had paused. Time slowed. The rustling of cloth, the shifting of feet, even the birds in the trees seemed to hold still. Every eye turned to her, every breath caught in the throat of anticipation. The sun, bright and unyielding, fell upon her like a witness, casting shadows that trembled across the courtyard. Then she moved. Not in anger, not in haste, but with a precision born of years of training. Her steps were measured, deliberate, and fluid. She positioned herself between the threat and the innocent life she carried, her body a channel of calm strength. Each motion was controlled, defensive, and purposeful. The world watched, still suspended in tension, as the quiet mastery of her form became the first movement of justice, a warning that strength is often unseen until the moment demands it. The courtyard, once alive with chatter, froze under the weight of her first step. Her body moved with a rhythm both familiar and strange, a harmony born of years of hidden discipline. Each motion was deliberate, precise, and full of purpose. She did not strike with rage, nor did she lash out blindly. Her power was calm, measured, and disciplined. A hush fell over the crowd, as if the air itself recognized the quiet mastery before it. She shifted, rooted firmly as the ancient soil beneath her feet, yet flowing like the river that had guided her ancestors for generations. Her form seemed less a physical act and more a dance of spirits, each movement echoing the lessons whispered to her in dreams and in the quiet corners of the family home. The rhythm of her body mirrored the wisdom of those who had come before, carrying their strength and their balance through her limbs. The man who had dared to mock her stood frozen, his smirk vanished, replaced by uncertainty. She intercepted the advancing threat with a sweep that disarmed without harm, a motion that protected rather than destroyed. The would-be aggressor stumbled back, confusion marking his features. The crowd, accustomed to loud displays of dominance, now witnessed a different kind of power, one that commanded respect without noise, one that delivered justice without cruelty. Whispers rose like wind across dry grass, spreading shock and disbelief. Eyes widened as long-held assumptions about weakness and obedience crumbled. Those who had assumed gentleness equaled fragility now saw strength defined in patience, control, and purpose. The husband's face turned red, not with power, but with shame. His arrogance had blinded him to the truth he now could not deny. The woman he had humiliated stood taller, morally and physically, than he ever had. Authority, once assumed by wealth and pride, dissolved in the presence of true mastery. His deception, his reliance on fear, and his dismissal of tradition were all laid bare before the very people he had hoped to impress. The crowd's silence, heavy with awe and recognition, spoke louder than words. She remained calm, breathing steady, each movement echoing the legacy of her ancestors, each gesture an unspoken lesson, that strength is not loud, and that justice, when guided by wisdom, is unstoppable. The elders stepped forward, their faces calm but their eyes sharp, like hawks that had been watching too long. Whispers of recognition passed through the crowd. Years of wisdom reclaimed the ground that arrogance had trampled. One elder raised a hand, palm open, and spoke in a voice both soft and commanding. "Those who forget the ways of their ancestors," he said, "cannot see strength when it stands quietly before them." The meaning of power shifted in the air. It was no longer measured by loud voices or by wealth displayed. The wife, her body still, her gaze steady, had shown that silence could shake the very foundation of the proud. Every eye saw it, a power that did not scream, yet moved hearts and minds. Even her unborn child became part of the revelation. The small life she carried was not a symbol of weakness but of sacred fire, a living testament to multiplied strength. Breath and life itself had joined in the act of justice, making the air thick with reverence. She lowered her hands, her movements smooth, deliberate. The danger had been neutralized. There was no vengeance, no cruelty, only the quiet fulfillment of moral law. Her control had proven greater than domination, and her calm left the world around her trembling with understanding. The husband stood, unsteady, his face pale. Pride that had once crowned him now sank into shame. He saw his reflection, not in glass or gold, but in the gaze of the community, the eyes of the elders, and the quiet strength of the woman he had wronged. I was blind," he murmured, a whisper lost among the stunned silence. He felt the weight of betrayal, not just to her, but to blood, to home, to the ancestral laws that had guided generations. The lesson was irreversible, etched into his spirit. Honor, once forsaken, leaves a wound that cannot be hidden, and the cost of forgetting tradition is measured not in words, but in loss that gnaws from within. Around him, the courtyard seemed to exhale. The elders' voices carried the unspoken verdict: respect the silent, uphold the sacred, or face the emptiness left by arrogance. And above it all, life pulsed quietly, sacred and unshaken, a testament that true strength had walked among them. The drumbeat that had filled the courtyard now faded into a heavy silence, leaving only the weight of truth behind. The air seemed to hold its breath as the crowd absorbed the quiet verdict written not in words, but in action and restraint. Mothers clutched their children a little tighter, elders nodded slowly, their eyes reflecting both relief and sorrow. Even the wind seemed to pause, carrying the smell of dust, sweat, and unsettled judgment across the open space. The gathering slowly began to disperse, but the echoes of what had been witnessed lingered. The husband stood alone, his chest rising and falling, but every exhale seemed to remind him of his failures. Faces that had once smiled in deference now turned away, whispers of his arrogance following him wherever he looked. Wealth could no longer shield him. The respect he had taken for granted had slipped like sand through his fingers. Inside, he felt the first cracks of collapse. Pride, once tall and impenetrable, crumbled quietly, leaving regret and confusion to fill the hollow space where certainty had lived. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words could undo the weight of shame. Meanwhile, the mistress, once bold and brazen, now stood exposed under the clear light of day. Her laughter had vanished, replaced by the uneasy shifting of those around her. Opportunism could no longer hide behind charm. Truth had unmasked her, and with it, her fleeting influence. The elders stepped forward, their presence steady and resolute. One raised a hand, the lines of age etched deep on his face. "Let the house remember," he said, "that honor cannot be bought, and the ways of our ancestors are not a story for amusement. We reclaim what has been broken. We restore the ground that arrogance dared to defile." The community listened, the final authority settling like dust over the courtyard. What had been shaken, trust, respect, sacred law, was now carefully returned, not by fear, but by the measured wisdom of those who had always known the balance between justice and mercy. The courtyard was quiet now, the echoes of confrontation faded into the soft hum of evening. She lowered her hand slowly, feeling the weight of what had passed, yet tasting no joy in retaliation. Victory had come, but not as a shout, not as a strike meant to humiliate. Instead, her triumph was measured, disciplined, a silent declaration that dignity outweighed vengeance. Neighbors and elders who had watched with bated breath felt the lesson settle in their hearts. "See," murmured one elder, "strength is not in the hand that strikes, but in the mind that chooses when to strike." The young women in the crowd exchanged glances, realizing that the quiet, unbroken mother before them carried a force far greater than anger. The husband knelt unsteadily, his face pale, his chest tight with shame. I see now," he stammered. "What I have done is beyond pride to fix. Forgive me, if you can." She met his eyes, but her gaze was steady, unclouded. Humility, she knew, could not be demanded, it had to be earned. She stepped back, the unborn child moving gently within her, a quiet flame of future life. Her thoughts were not on punishment, but on protection, on the path forward. "My choice," she said softly, almost to herself, "is guided by the life I carry, by the honor I keep, and by the lessons we must all learn." The elders nodded, their expressions serene. One spoke, "Listen well, children of this village. Strength is measured in restraint, wisdom, and the courage to stand by what is just. The silent heart often holds more power than the loudest voice." She turned to the waiting son, feeling the heat on her face, the wind as it whispered through the courtyard. Strength was no longer a weapon to dominate, it was a shield for life, a guide for those who followed, a balance between tradition and the changing world. The city's walls, the streets beyond, and the open earth of her ancestors all bore witness. A new kind of warrior stood among them, tempered by patience, rooted in discipline, and carrying tomorrow quietly in her womb. The crowd dispersed slowly, carrying the memory of her calm as a lesson. The husband remained, bowed in humility, and the mistress had vanished into the shadow of her own exposed ambition. And in the heart of the home, a child not yet born stirred, carrying the promise of a future where strength protected rather than destroyed, and where wisdom walked hand in hand with power.